Well, really nice to meet all of you guys. Really exciting to hear that a lot of you are, starting your digital development journey. And I do think that, the principles for digital development are a great introduction to think about how to really integrate digital into your programs. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. As you see on the screen, these are the 9 principles for digital development. And they're pretty broad, but these are best guidelines for, again, how to integrate digital into your programming and concepts to sort of keep in mind as you're developing tools or thinking about like how they should be used. So I have 2 main objectives for all of you today. The first one is to really broadly introduce each principle, whether this is a refresh for you or just starting to get to know them. I hope that you have a better understanding of what these principles are. And then after that, we're going to sort of apply what we have learned into a quick, short card game where we're going to do a little bit of role playing, but more on that later. So first, I'm going to start with, why the digital principles. So they've been in existence for nearly a decade now. At its advent, digital technologies like the mobile phone were being increasingly used by, people who work in development. And this has opened up a lot of opportunities, such as increasing access to services, like providing market price information for rural farmers, financial services for previously unbanked, or like maternal health messaging for women who live far away from the reach of doctors or health clinics. So while the potential was really clear about how we could use digital technologies, the success of implementing the projects was less so. Like pilots often failed to go past the pilot stage. There were siloed sectors. They were unable to scale into sustainable programs, or services that were really designed far away from the communities that they had intended to serve. So lots of reasons that made implementing digital really hard to scale in the long term. So with that being said, realizing these reasons for failures, several large donor organizations and multilateral actors began talking about the failure of use of technology in development. So soon, sets of principles, lessons, and best practices began to emerge, starting with the UNICEF Innovation Principles in 2009, also the Green Tree Principles, the UK's Government Design Services, just to name a few. So after all these practices started coming out, they were eventually all sort of brought together and synthesized to make, one set of principles, which is now Principles for Digital Development. And that working group launched in 2014, included donor representative and practitioners from a lot of different development organizations, including like nonprofits, consultancies, and such. And so the working group met 9 times in the course of a year to discuss each principle individually, what that really meant, and to hold like deep dive events and try to flesh out, what does good look like in development. So again, here we are back to the principles as we know them today. And I won't spend like a ton of time on each one, but I will go down through the list just so you have a little bit more of an understanding of what they mean. So starting left side, design with the user. That's probably the principle that people find the easiest to understand and integrate. And we tend to start with that one. Also because we like to think that, designing with the user, your user should really be your number 1 priority on your list. So all it really means to involve end users from the beginning of the design of the project lifecycle to address the specific context, culture, behaviors, and expectations for who you're trying to ultimately provide services to. So next we have understand the existing ecosystem, which is tangentially related. So you're not only learning about the people that you're designing for, but the entire like network, culture, the politics, infrastructure, everything that really makes up the ecosystem that you're working with so that you don't duplicate efforts or violate norms. And then we have design for scale, which simply means that you're thinking beyond the pilot phase and making design choices at the beginning that will enable widespread adoption later if that's what your project calls for. Similarly, building for sustainability means looking in the long term, collaborating with stakeholders, defining what sustainability and long-term ownership looks like, and developing that blueprint for how to achieve that. So we also want to make sure that we're able to measure the impact of the work, not that we're just producing projects. So focusing on outcomes, not just outputs. So when you're thinking about how to be data-driven, that means just designing your program so that impact can be measured continuously and incrementally. So now we get into the use open standards, open data, open source innovation. And unlike the design with user principle, people often say that this is the most difficult to understand and integrate, because I know there's like some conflict sometimes with proprietary ownership. And there's like a lot of discourse about that, but all we really mean about this principle is to be more open about your work and encourage of taking advantage of existing investments in technology when you're able, and to increase collaboration, again, to prevent that duplication. So in the same spirit of the open principle, we have reuse and improve next, which means to assess what technology, what resources are already available, and to iterate on them to improve applicability or quality, and to use them to make sure that they meet, you can adapt them to make sure they meet your program goals. So, however, in the same vein, one issue that one might have with open data is addressing privacy and security. So, although the principles do encourage sharing resources and learnings, it's important to keep that balance, find what works for your context and your program, and again, like design with user, keep the best interest of your stakeholders whose data is being collected at the forefront, and pretend like it's your information, and really try to build in safeguarding practices. And all that is to really say is to be collaborative, our final principle. Seek out opportunities with others, meaning sharing information, insights, strategies, and resources to really ensure collective success of the community. Because I know it's really tough when we're all working on our own programs, but we're all working towards some common vision of just providing resources and services to people who stand to benefit from it the most. So today we're at over 230 endorsing organizations, and this is sort of just like the toe dip into what the principles are. We do offer many more deep dive trainings about how this can be a little bit more applicable to your program. We have a ton more resources of how you can measure use of the principles in your programming on our website. But that said, if you have any questions on that, you can always get in touch with me directly. We also have our inbox where we field just general questions. But before we move on to the card game, I would love to take this opportunity just to take any questions off the bat from participants.
We have a lovely comment about pilotitis from Adrian. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. Adrian, you've unmuted, but I don't know if you have a question.
I don't have a question. That was a very good overview. Yeah, it is a culture shift we're dealing with here. And we have to flee any assumptions and be very open-minded if this is actually going to have an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard, again, to shift from, focusing on your own program, your own, reporting, how are you showing that, your organization adds value. That can be hard when you're trying to, we often sometimes feel like you're almost competing for those resources, but you need to remember, being collaborative, you can actually probably go further when we kind of pull those resources and learnings together.
Yep.
So great. All right.
Actually, sorry. I have a question, if that's okay. In terms of understanding the ecosystem and reusing and improving, how do we discover what's out there? I think that's where I am. I'm wanting to look at what's there and then help our groups interact with it and build upon it as appropriate.
Mm-hmm. So with understanding the ecosystem, I know that, it's a lot of stakeholder interviews. So who are you ultimately trying to serve? Is it like mothers in Zambia? So like being able to conduct those interviews, like what do they actually need, what's missing, what tools or like what resources they actually have. So if you're trying to give them a mobile app to track like pregnancy, like do they actually use that stuff? And
sorry, I miss, my question was unclear. I meant what apps do we know that are out there that are in use actively and the feedback on them?
I don't have any off the top of my head. Do you mean like apps that we're using for specific projects, or?
Yeah, I want to understand what's in use in what contexts.
Can you clarify that question a little bit more?
Oh, sorry. I'm doing a very bad job with this question. I'd like to understand what apps, what digital technology is being used for, feedback loops, M&E, or, sharing maternal health messages, or, what's currently being used successfully in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So I get an overview of what's out there.
Yeah, so I can give one example. We do have an endorser called Amplio, and they have this tool called the Talking Book, which is basically like a device that has audio messages for community members. So that addresses like maybe low literacy rates so they can listen to the messaging, and in turn they give feedback about the content or what they want to hear by also recording themselves. So there's like a little bit of an iterative, direct feedback loop with Amplio and the communities that they're working with. So that's an example. We have other endorsers who are doing other things, but I can look into that a little bit more and give you more specifics if that doesn't answer your question.
Hannah, I've also got a comparison of different apps and how to choose them, which was recommended by some colleagues at Bond. There's a sort of overview of some apps to do certain things. So I'll dig that out of my emails for you, Hannah.
Oh, thank you. That's kind.
Anything else? Comments? Anyone want to like add to that? I'm sure many people have also worked with digital tools that I might not be aware of.
I was, sorry, it's Emma. I was going to say my brief experience of looking into it is that there's just so much.
Mm-hmm.
In every context, in every country, there's a different developer and private sector. There's just so many different an overlap between the applications as well. And I think that's maybe why it's difficult to know where to start. And especially because we're supporting, they're quite small groups, sort of kitchen table charities, so a lot of them don't have paid staff, so it's very sort of low resource for them, and you're looking at low bandwidth and so on. So it's just kind of working out what's already happening and not overlapping.
Yeah, I think that's helpful to know like where you're working, to know what other like NGOs or local actors are already in the area and see what projects they have and what tools they're utilizing. I think that's a pretty good place to start. All right. So Laura, do we have still more time for questions, or should we try to move into the game?
Moving into the game would be lovely. We've got the breakout rooms nearly teed up for you.
All right. Okay. So game time, everyone. So we do have in our full day training, we have this game called the Sustainable Development Goals and Digital Principles card game. Very creative title, I know. But so we're going to split this group into 2 teams, the donor team and the project design team. So you are going to get these 2 cards. There's an SDG card and the principles card. So you're both teams will look at them. So the donor team will look at the project and try to come up with 2 to 3 questions to ask the project team, how are you designing with the user? So it might be a question like, how do you know that SMS is the best way to engage with cassava farmers in Zambia? Things like that. Like, how do they actually design with the user for this tool? For the project design team, your job is to work with your group to anticipate what questions the donor team might have about design with user. So in those separate rooms, those are going to be your discussions. And then we're going to come back after 5 minutes. And then the project design team will have a designated speaker to make a quick, minute or so pitch about the project. And then after the pitch, donor team will ask some questions, their questions, and the project design team will try to answer them. And this is just a fun way to start thinking about how do we think about the principles when we're proposing projects. Okay, any questions on that? I'll be coming in and out of rooms just to make sure everyone is sort of clear.
And if you're not familiar with breakout rooms, it's just a click join and you will automatically be moved from one to the other. And I will allow you to come back to the main room, but we'll be moving Claudine around. So in case you have any questions, we'll be here to do that. So I will just launch the breakout rooms and you'll just need to press join. Claudine, is that okay?
Yes, and I know that not everyone who RSVP'd has joined, so these groups that are up on the slide might have shifted a little bit. So Laura, will you let people know whether they're on the donor or the project team?
Absolutely. So I've got Adrian, Jessie, and Ruth on the that would be the project design team. Chrissy, Emma, Hannah, and Julian, you're going to be on the donor team. So I hope that's clear. Breakout room 1 is going to be the project design, and breakout room 2 is the donor.
Yes, and I will drop a link into the chat so you can look at these 2 cards a little bit more. Okay, so you guys had the chance to talk in your small groups, come up with and anticipate questions. So those on the project design team, will your representative speaker, kick us off, tell us a little bit about the project and convince the donor team why they should give you funding?
We talked about these farmers getting timely information on prices, markets, transport, demand by text message, and we then began to talk about the costs of mobile phones, data packages, what type of mobile phones people have, how they would charge their mobile phones, and we thought about having some community roundtable events to gauge the usefulness of this type of project or not, and how to best design it. So we're still in the assessment phase. Over.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So donor team, over to you. How do you feel about this project? What questions do you have for our project design team?
Well, we sort of, there were a lot of questions. I think the project design team already highlighted some of them. We would be interested in having the proposal demonstrate to us the actual level of mobile penetration in terms of ownership and signal among the target communities. So can the farmers receive SMSs regularly or just when they travel to certain places, and roughly how many farmers have phones? And there would also be questions about whether there are sort of gender disparities there, I think. Also with the kind of information that was planned to be shared by SMS, because there's a big difference between SMS information sharing very specific things about, I don't know, maybe relative market prices per kilo, or some quite complex instructions or guidance about, I don't know, application of conservation agriculture techniques, which might be just really difficult to convey in a short text message. So maybe it's not the best tool for that. We'd also be interested to hear if there was examples of previously successful SMS campaigns in the same communities, maybe on a different topic such as health. And there was something else which I've forgotten, but my donor colleagues will chip in at this point, I think. Did I forget something, Gang? No?
I just said it was good.
Yeah, so awesome questions. Those are some tough questions. Project design team. Any answers to that?
I would be very impressed if we had all the answers in a short 5 minutes. I think we might be out of answers.
Yeah, I think we were a bit confused about about what to talk about, and we didn't get the card for a little while. But those are all really great questions, and that we will find out from further interviews and roundtables with the community.
Excellent, excellent. Yep. So that's an example of, the kind of like principles lens that you can be thinking about as you're assessing proposals, things like that. So I think we do actually have enough time to do a little switcheroo. So if you were on the donor team, you are now the project design team, and vice versa. So in the link that I have sent, at the top of the screen, let me show you real quick. You should be able to see, let me know if you can see my screen. You should be able to see up here a little arrow for next frame. This is your next scenario card and principles card. So now we'll be talking about addressing privacy and security. So we're gonna get back into the same groups, but just keep in mind that you are on the opposite team now. Happy discussions.
That might have better security and better maintenance of data instead of just putting it out there in an unscreened way. So we were looking at having a job board potentially, but within an institution instead, where people could flag interest in things. But yeah, we discovered that this SMS approach wasn't suitable. Fair, folks?
Thank you very much, Hannah. So donor team, let's start with maybe one question that you might have for the project design team. We'll give the project design team a chance to answer that, and then we'll kind of keep going back and forth like that. So will someone from the donor team please kick us off with a burning question you might have?
So you've jumped ahead of one of us, which was why SMS. So one of our questions would be, where is the data being kept and who's got access to the data at any given time?
I think in the new model, people wouldn't be submitting their personal data to the platform. So they would be able to view the opportunities and they'd have their personal data held themselves, and then when they choose to, they would go direct to the employer. So it's more of an advertising rather than a brokering scheme. I think we struggled, yeah, it was really the context that we spent quite a lot of time discussing in terms of that being a challenging environment to be sharing data and what was appropriate and what wasn't. And obviously with, private, if you're using SMS, then there's the private sector, the people that are operating the networks and so on. And how do you ensure that they have security on their systems?
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, so building all that infrastructure. Any other questions from the donor team?
I think in those two answers, you've rather met all of our questions, which were largely about data security, consents and permissions, and you know, who has access, who can edit it, how's it encrypted. But I think, yeah, you've pretty much answered those. Does anybody else from my group want to come in on that at all?
Can I ask a question to Claudine, though? Is there a sort of right answer? I mean, is there an, like, in this context, do you know of such a scheme that you could actually implement such a project?
So the fun thing about these scenario cards is that they're actually based on real life projects. So I don't exactly know which organization has implemented it, but it does exist. So not something I could answer, but I'm sure they've considered it. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, so that's the SDG card game. Again, just like an introduction of like how to think about principles as you're designing or looking at programming. So that's, like I said, it's one activity of like a full day training full of like more interactive role-playing exercises. But with that said, thank you guys for participating, for all the creative questions and discussion. I'm going to go ahead, kick it back to Laura to lead us on to any wrap up things.
Excellent. So we've got a wee bit of time to ask any questions, and I've got a couple up my sleeve. But does anyone have any questions immediately that they'd like to ask Claudine about the principles, about how they relate to practical work? If you feel free to unmute yourself and you can dive in with questions if you have any.
Claudine, do you have any country by country database of what you need to know about digital programming in the country? I mean, for example, a couple of years ago I was working in Ethiopia, and the mobile network and the internet network is very, very poor countrywide. It's a real headache. But I only know that because I've been there. In terms of the ecosystem, how do we get a handle on an ecosystem we haven't visited?
That is a fantastic question. So we currently don't have any country by country database like that exists. However, we do have some resources that might be able to guide you in thinking of how to consider the ecosystem that you're going into. So we have this tool called the Digital Principles Maturity Matrix. So
sorry, Digital Principles what matrix?
Maturity Matrix.
Okay, yep, correct word, good.
So it's a little bit complicated to understand for this call right now, but essentially say that you are interested in assessing good, let's say, you're trying good assessment of like the ecosystem you're working with. So in this matrix, you can, prioritize the principle, understand the ecosystem, and it'll take you sort of through a series of questions for, have you considered like X, Y, Z? You rate yourself on a scale from like 1 to 3 on how your project or how your team has actually thought about these considerations, and it'll give you like an ultimate score of like how you've done. And if you didn't do too great, it'll provide like more resources on like, where you can be on like tools or other organizations you can reach out to better use that principle in your work.
Yeah, so I guess it's a bit of a kind of an iterative process. because otherwise you have the potential to waste a lot of time and resources on a modality or modalities that are just not appropriate for any number of socio-economic, technological reasons. Yeah, environmental reasons.
Yeah, excellent point though. But yeah, that's a
Can I
great.
just ask something related to what Adrian was saying? So there's, for example, with some of the groups we work with, a lot of them work in education. So they work with teachers in secondary schools, and the model now has generally been to go over for 2 weeks and do some training and come back. Obviously, we've talked about that for a long, long time in terms of sustainability in the model. But so now they're looking to do training online. So there's say 4 groups in Wales who are working in different countries in different groups of teachers and schools. But from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like there'd be one solution that would suit those 4 groups, because they're all working in different contexts. So you always have to start with the country context.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be, oh, we're all training teachers, so therefore there's one solution. It's going to be the opposite.
Yeah. Country to country, always different on what's accessible, what platforms can be used. Again, going back to connectivity. So it's like a lot of work, but it's important just to making sure that your tools are actually relevant and can be used by the people who need to use them.
Yeah, and it's similar with Health Links, which is another group that we work with quite a lot. But they're probably more resistant to, because it's such a practical training. So there's a bit of a pushback on using online. Anyway, that's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue, because we actually just released a podcast. So we have a podcast series. Our latest episode was actually on designing user-centered programs and tools, particularly for education. And some of our speakers do talk about how they design these tools and get iterative feedback from their user communities and teachers that they're training. So can share that if you're interested in sort of learning what other groups have been doing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions before I jump in with a chair's privilege to ask a question or two? I'll take silence as an opportunity to ask a quick question, if I may. I'm really interested to know, Claudine, we've spoken a little bit already about how it can be used with small NGOs. We've talked a little bit about, what the principles mean when we're unfamiliar with them. Can you use them when you're turning an existing project into a digital project, like we're transitioning now, particularly with the context of COVID? Do you think that they're useful in redesigning an existing project? How would you go about doing that? Do you have any hints or tips? For example, we might have designed a project but not had them in mind at the beginning. Does that make sense?
So if you have a project that might have been meant to be delivered in person, but now you're trying to make it available digitally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I'd be curious to know. I suppose I think it's a good idea to think about who that tool is supposed to be serving. Is it more are you working more with making this tool available to government officials, for more rural communities? So I think, again, designing with the user, understanding what context and capabilities they have is a good place to start, and how you're actually, how am I trying to say this? How you're maybe already using digital in your programs, what can you adapt to fit that project. So you know, you might have a team member who's already using maybe an SMS campaign. Like, can that be utilized for your purposes as well? So that's a place to start, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting. So take it back to the drawing board a little bit and look at the principles and really assess what you've got going. You wouldn't, for example, recommend, if you've got an existing program that you wanted to turn into a more digital intervention, you wouldn't, for example, suggest going in with a maturity matrix just to see where you're at?
You can, yeah, you can certainly go with the maturity matrix to see where that's like a really good place to start with for the design phase, I suppose. So as you're starting to build out your solution or your tool, the maturity matrix is really useful more for that design phase. People have used it for, you know, retrospectively, but again, it's better to think about these things at the beginning.
Absolutely, for sure. So that's, I have a couple more questions lined up, and we do have about 10 more minutes to take any questions. Does anyone else have any questions? Take silence as a no. Just in case you do, you're welcome to add them to the chat box there. I did just want to ask Claudine, really what the phrase human-centered design really means. What does it practically mean? I see it a lot, and I get asked lots of questions, and you see it a lot in proposals to donors and things like that. Could you maybe give a practical example of what human-centered design might look like in a project?
Sure. So I think user-centered design is just, for my conversation with people, it's just another way of saying, again, design with the user, not even with the user in mind. So it's about directly engaging those stakeholders, the people who will be using the tool or will be benefiting from the program, and making sure it actually addresses a problem that they have. So for example, when I went to a conference in, I believe it was Tanzania several years ago, part of the discussion was, you know, NGOs came in and provided mosquito nets to, you know, local communities because they thought, you know, malaria was a big thing. So here are mosquito nets to prevent that. However, the local community ended up using those mosquito nets for fishing because they thought it was more useful, you know, for more useful for that use. They said, like, you know, we already have like solutions for malaria, we're dealing with that, okay, but our actual problem is that we don't have sufficient fishing tools. So that's like a way to think about, you don't just go in with a solution and identify it, taking time to like sit down with those people and be like, what do you actually need? How can we help you?
That's a really nice example.
Yeah, I love that story. That stuck with me for a long time. I was like, fascinating.
Thank you. That's really clear. So I'm just going to pause again if anyone has a question cropped up in their mind before I ask my final question. Emma.
The fishing net, sorry.
I was just going to ask if you had a example of the reuse and improve principle. If you had a good example of that where people have looked at what's already there but then repurposed it, or however that works.
Yeah, so we have another person in our network in Cambodia. So they developed this hotline that was initially used to detect outbreaks of influenza in rural communities. And that was, like, you know, really helpful for that. And so they've recently repurposed that for the COVID response. So people in the rural communities, they have like access to like mobile phones, and being able to repurpose that to, instead of reporting outbreaks of influenza, to report possible cases of COVID has really like helped keep the social distancing while also making sure that, you know, if a certain case needed attention, people at like the CDC over in Cambodia could assess if that's something that actually needed like attention. So that's an example that I can think of off the top of my head. So instead of building something new, they readapted it.
Adrian, did you have a thought or comment?
Quite a few, but I think that whole fishing net, mosquito net, that is a really good example of needing to assess the ecosystem. Very well intended, but the nets were repurposed because of reality. And I think that basic principle is it's the kind of thing I'm dealing with all the time with water and sanitation programs. So yeah, it's nice to be reminded of that story.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because sometimes you might even like it's a funny thing to balance, because sometimes you go in and they might say our problem is fish, we need, the community might tell you that they need something, but as you develop the tool, you realize maybe fishing nets isn't necessarily the answer. Maybe they might need different, they might need different kind of boat or something. That's not the clearest example, but it's an iterative process. So as you develop tools, just recognizing that that might change, and the problem might be a little different than initially thought.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you may need to rapidly change something. I mean, we've had a situation in Mozambique recently where the government have been promoting the use of ash or soap for hand washing, for COVID-19 response, prevention. And we know that soap is what you need, not ash, for COVID-19. That is what you need. You need hand washing with soap, not hand washing with soap or ash. It's hand washing with soap. So an issue there is, how do you rapidly transmit that message? If you know the ecosystem and how information and rumors are moving through the communities there, and from a digital point of view, you're much better positioned to respond to that informatic problem.
No,
so
absolutely.
Again, ecosystem knowledge is key. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we were working with a case study lately with one of our endorsers, and it was interesting to hear that they actually didn't really work closely with local government officials on spreading messaging, because there was so much distrust in the local government. So they actually had to work with religious groups and churches to spread health messages.
Yeah. Right messages, right channels. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Chrissy, did you have a question? Did you just unmute yourself? No.
Just an observation, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think all these discussions have sort of served to underline for me that essentially project design and good project design is at the bottom of so much, and that if your project design is solid and you're clear what you're trying to achieve, then the sort of options for selecting tools about how to deliver that, you're kind of looking at those with informed eyes and making informed choices, and there's maybe a sort of wider choice of different tools around these days, but that the fundamentals of project design, and are you doing something which is appropriate, and is it needed, and is it sort of likely to achieve what you want it to achieve. If you don't have that, then there's just I don't know, more rabbit holes to get lost down.
Yeah, and actually, I think someone had asked about resources for assessing ecosystem or databases. So I know an individual who recently published this report called the Tech for Good Field Guide, and this is an incredible resource where he pulls together different databases, different reports that can really help address, that can really help you get a good sense of what already exists out there. So, and again, it's just such an amazing resource that I do recommend, if you're trying to get an idea of what currently exists in the tech ecosystem, just take a look at this, and yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you most of all to Claudine for a fantastic presentation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure we all have too. We'd love to see you at some upcoming events here at the Alliance. We've got some workshops next week. Funnily enough. One is on project design and another one's on responsible photography. And we have a plethora of other events, so do check out our website if you're interested in coming to some other workshops. And we hope you can continue the conversation online with us. The Principles for Development do have an online community there. It's sort of an open source forum, so you can get in touch there. If you're an Alliance member, we've got our own discourse forum, and you're most welcome to get in touch there and continue discussing and sharing examples. And we would love to hear a little bit of your feedback on today. We've got a wee feedback survey, and I'll make sure that the link is dropped either in an email or the chat box now. Just let us know how the Zoom call was for you today, and if you'd like to find any more further information on the digital principles. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely day and continue to stay safe and well, and we hope to see you soon.